Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be covering another lesson on a fundamental debate in American history, segregationists versus integrationists. If you don't know what these things are, that's okay. We're going to cover it in this video so that you're prepared for the lesson. As always, let's start by going over the order of things. First, we're going to go over the learning targets that this assignment hits. Second, we're going to explain what you're expected to be able to do by the end of this assignment. Next, we're going to cover key vocabulary and background that's necessary in order to understand the assignment, and this is actually super extra important for this particular lesson. Right? Then we're going to walk through the assignment, post it in Empower, and complete an example using Document 1, which is a 1954 Supreme Court decision, so that you understand not only what to do, but also the level of work that's expected to earn that 3.0. So, the target that this lesson hits is going to be the following. Right? You do need a 3.0 or above on this assignment, otherwise you'll have to revise it. So the learning target in question is HID 1, which stands for Historical Ideas, number 1, the first learning target on that scale, which is analyze the origins of fundamental political and social debates and explain how opposing perspectives, compromises, and cooperation have shaped national unity and diversity. For example, suffrage, human and civil rights, the role and scope of government within the economy, and citizens' lives. And in this case, right, those are the things that this learning target can cover. This attaches directly to civil rights. Okay? This is the third and final assignment for this particular target. You've already done 2 more. So the goals for this assignment. First, learners will be able to read multiple primary source types and determine the source's point of view and provide evidence for their reasoning. So ultimately, you're going to identify, hey, this source is integrationist, this source is segregationist, and here is why. Here's the evidence that tells me why this is. Okay, the second goal, learners will be able to summarize arguments for segregation and integration in their own words. And this in their own words piece is really important. I want to know that you understand these arguments. Anybody can copy, paste, cut things. That doesn't mean you actually understand it. It means you can recognize it. By putting it in your own words, explaining it as though you were explaining it to like a 5 or 6-year-old cousin, tells me that you know what these things mean, that you can sort of think about them, process them, and put them out in a different way. Okay? The last but not least here, learners will be able to evaluate, which means judge, the strength or effectiveness, not whether the argument is, quote, right or wrong, of the arguments presented for segregation and integration. That's a really confusing concept, and we're actually going to dig into this a little bit later, and we'll also do at least one example of that. So in this lesson, you will examine 5 primary sources of differing points of view on the topic of segregation and tied to that integration. Technically, you're only going to be doing 4 because I'm going to complete one with you as an example at the end of this video. You will also read each document and determine its point of view. Here you only have 2 options, segregation or integration. Those are the only 2 options since that's really what the lesson focuses on. Then you're going to summarize the argument presented by each document in your own words. You're going to provide some evidence for your reasoning. Why do you say that? Then you're going to judge if the reasons provided by that source for segregation or integration are strong or convincing arguments or not. Again, we'll dig into that and what that looks like. And then after examining all the sources provided, you'll be asked to judge which point of view, segregation or integration, made the strongest arguments. So you're going to look at all the evidence as a whole and sort of answer that question. So you're looking at it for each document, but then you're looking at it as a group after you've examined everything. All right, so before digging into this assignment and its requirements, let's dig into some important ideas and background information that you need to understand in order to complete this lesson. And again, I feel that this is a little bit more important than usual for this lesson, given some of the complex ideas and the things you need to know in order to be able to do it. So first we'll cover Jim Crow laws, and then the concept of, quote, separate but equal, which ties to a famous 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. We're going to talk about what the civil rights movement is/was. We're going to talk about how we would define segregation or segregationist, which is one of the key things you really need to know for this lesson. Also, integration and integrationist. We're going to talk about strong, effective arguments versus arguments that are right and wrong. And again, this is where we really dig into that concept of what you're being asked to do. We're going to talk about, quote, states' rights, which you're going to encounter in at least 1 to 2 sources. And we're going to talk briefly about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And sorry, I forgot one. We're going to be discussing value. You have one question at the end of this lesson that asks you about the value of something. And I want to make sure that you completely understand what it is that you're being asked. All right, so we're going to start off with Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws was the name for local and state laws in southern states that forced blacks and whites to be in separate public places. And so here's some examples. You can see a sign here that says public swimming pool white only, again, separating whites and blacks. And you can see a sign here that says waiting room for colored or blacks only by order of police department. These are very common kinds of things that you would see in the South in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s. And this is what really a lot of people were fighting against, was the separation in society and working towards bringing people together. Right? Now we're going to talk about the concept of separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson is an important 1896 Supreme Court case. This is the case that makes Jim Crow laws legal. Right? The decision stated that creating separate facilities, by facilities we mean schools, theaters, bathrooms, for whites and blacks is okay as long as they are equal. This established the rule known as separate but equal, right? You can have separate bathrooms, but they have to be equal. Separate schools for blacks and whites, but they have to be equal. The problem is that in reality and in practice, none of these things were actually equal. And you can kind of see that here from this actual photograph in the 50s of a drinking fountain somewhere in the South, don't know where. You can see that the white fountain is actually very nice, has the cooler in it, and then you can see the, quote, colored or black fountain, which is dirty, filthy, is not going to put out cold water, is falling apart. And this is extremely common during this time in the South. And this is what Jim Crow or separate but equal looks like. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement started in the early 1950s, and it's going to run into the late 60s. This is the name for the organized attempt by African Americans to demand and gain equal rights and social equality within American society. Right? Major leaders of this movement included Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which we'll touch briefly on at the end of this here. All right, so here's some pictures of what the Civil Rights Movement looked like. You can see African Americans protesting for equal treatment, for equal rights, right? They want black and whites together. And you can see that they are marching for integrated schools, which we'll talk about what integration and integrated means here in just a moment. So remember that a key part of this lesson is you have to determine point of view of each source. Is it segregationist or integrationist? So here's what segregation or segregationist means. Segregation is the forced legal separation of one group of people from another. In this case, it's separating blacks and whites. A segregationist is someone or something that wants blacks and whites separate in society. If you read a source and it explains why races should be separate or the dangers of mixing the races can create, it supports segregation and is therefore segregationist. Right? So here's some examples of what segregationist things might look like or say. Right? Here's a poster that says, we want white tenants in our white community. Right? They want whites and blacks separate, meaning they only want whites in this area. That second picture is sort of a group of white protesters that are basically saying, you know, we have states' rights, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, and that segregation is sort of our choice, in that we want whites and blacks separate, right? This differs from integration or integrationist, which is actually the total opposite, right? Segregation and integration are the opposite. Integration is the act of integrating or bringing things together. In this case, integration was the demand of African Americans. They wanted to become part of regular American society, not be separate from it. If you read a source and it calls for equality or an interracial separation, it's going to be supporting integration or what we would call integrationist. Right? And so here's a famous picture of an African American student who's one of the first 9 black students to be admitted to a white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Right? And this is integration. Right? The black student is going to the white school. And so whites and blacks are coming together in society. Now I want to take a moment and talk about this concept of strong, effective arguments versus what it is to say that an argument is right or wrong. And this one is extremely tricky. In this assignment, you're going to be asked to assess, which basically means judge arguments. You're not being asked to judge if the argument is okay or not, or good or bad, or even right or wrong. Instead, what I'm asking for you to do, and sort of your challenge with this argument, is asking, is it strong or convincing or not at all? So let me kind of give you a weird example here. So let's take a look at this example. I shot and killed a person because they were trying to break into my home and hurt my family. I think everyone is going to agree that murder is never okay. If I were to ask, is murder okay? Nobody would raise their hand. The argument above isn't right, right? It's wrong to kill someone. It's not okay, but it is convincing to the point that we accept, oh, okay, I killed someone because those I love and myself were in danger, right? This is an effective, stronger, convincing argument. Even though it argues something that's wrong, we accept it and we're sort of convinced by like, oh, okay, well, we'll give you a free pass. Like, it's still messed up. Murder is not okay. But at least in this case, like, I understand why you did it and you're good to go, right? And so that's what we're asking. Is the argument that's being presented, is it convincing or effective? I'm not asking you to judge like, hey, this argument is wrong because it's unfair. No, it might be unfair. I want to know, is it convincing or not? Okay, so some of the sources and arguments that you're going to be looking at in this assignment are pretty obviously and openly racist. No one would call these good, okay, or right arguments. That's not what I'm asking you to do. Instead, I'm asking you to look at the argument itself and answer, is it convincing or is it just really poorly thought out? Is it just a bad argument? Okay, so states' rights. We talked briefly about this earlier, and you will encounter this idea a little bit in the documents. This is also a complicated issue. Let me pose this question to you. Who decides what rules people live under? Should it be state governments or the national government? Many believe that state and local laws matter more because people living there have the freedom to decide their own rules and make laws that fit local needs and beliefs. More importantly, the national government should not have the power to force free people in Mississippi to follow the same laws as Alaska if the people in Mississippi don't agree with the law. So this is where things start to get complicated. All right, let me give you a hypothetical here. If the state of Mississippi wants to ban black people from public places, should that power rest with the people of Mississippi? Or does the federal government have the power to force laws requiring fairness and equity on Mississippi that people living in Mississippi might not want? Right? So this is where we get into that issue. Who decides the rules? Is it the local community and sort of that state level? Or is this the national government, which can sometimes totally misunderstand or not recognize the needs of people in that area? Who should have that power? And that's really a huge argument that we're still having to this day politically, right? So you're going to encounter this argument in the documents, and it's a classic argument. The belief that free people of the state have the power and right to choose their own laws, even when those laws hurt or unfairly treat others. It doesn't matter because it's that local community, right? A majority of that local community wants that thing. And so it's them exercising their freedom and ability to govern themselves. So this brings us to our second to final point, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an important leader of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, right? That push for African American rights and equal treatment. He organized protests, and his speeches showed the injustice African Americans faced in the South, but most importantly, he believed that the only way to achieve equal rights was through nonviolent protests. He is one of the most famous integrationists in American history. So if you see anything there by Dr. Martin Luther King, it's probably integrationist, and that should make sense because he's talking about bringing blacks and whites together. Right? And here, of course, is a photo of Dr. Martin Luther King giving a speech. Okay. So the last concept, and there's one question in this lesson that I really want to touch on this, it's about value. In this situation, value refers to something's usefulness, worth, or importance. Right? Is something valuable? Does it have importance? Does it have use? Not necessarily how much something is worth or it costs in terms of money. Like, what is the value of those Jordans? That's not the issue. It's like, are they useful? Does it have importance or meaning that we can assess to it? So in this assignment, you will be asked to judge if racist sources have value. Another way to think about this is this. Do racist things have some usefulness or worth in understanding history, or does the racist nature of them make them worthless to the point that we should either forget, ban, or simply ignore them? Right? Or is there some value, meaning, importance, understanding that can be drawn from it? And this is an increasingly complicated and relevant question as we see modern conflicts over things like the Confederate flag, Civil War statues, and the banning of Dr. Seuss books playing kind of out around us. Right? So at this point, we're going to take a look at directions or steps for completion. At this stage, we're going to switch to the assignment sheet. We'll start by going over the directions and reading through the questions so that we know what to do and look for as we read. This is a strategy used by strong readers. Okay. We'll finish up by completing the questions listed for document 1 as an example so that you understand what is expected of you for that 3.0. And finally, we'll go over the required summative questions at the end of the assignment, and we'll briefly talk about the optional questions if you want that 3, 5, or 4. So let's go on ahead and dig in here. All right, I'm gonna move this out of the way. And you can see here, this is the assignment sheet that appears in Empower, and you can tell because it has the exact same title. Please make sure to include your first and last name and your period up here at the top. I'm going to go on ahead and start by reading the directions here. Below are 5 sources of diverse format and point of view. They have been arranged chronologically, meaning by time. Source 1 comes from an important and famous 1954 Supreme Court decision when the Supreme Court decided if all white schools had to accept African American children if they lived geographically close by. The last source is an important letter written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 10 years later in 1964. These sources are not arranged by point of view, but when it was created. The first thing that you are asked to do is identify if the source's point of view supports segregation, meaning the idea or belief that whites and blacks should be legally separated, or integration, meaning the idea or belief that whites and blacks should live together in society. For full explanation of these terms, please watch the video attached. Hopefully you're doing that. And that's that. After reading the source and identifying its point of view, you'll be asked to summarize the argument for segregation or integration presented within the document. Identify if and what kind of racism appears in the document, if any does, because not all documents are going to show racism. And you're asked to assess if it's a strong, effective argument or not, right? Not judge if the argument is right or wrong, okay, good or bad, but rather, is it convincing? And explain why. Any questions after these will clearly be marked for a 3-5 or a 4-0. These questions are not required, but offer the option to raise your score if completed clearly and accurately. There are also 4 summative questions that appear after the documents, which are required for a 3.0. These must be completed with clear responses to earn the 3.0. Any questions appearing after those 4 will be optional and for a higher score. The first document, document 1, is completed for you, right? We're going to do it now. And an explanation of how to complete it is found here in this video. All right, so let's go on ahead, and before we dig into document 1, let's take a look at what we're actually asked to do, right? This is that strategy that strong readers use. We look for what we're asked for, and then we search for it, rather than reading and then trying to find it after the fact. Right? It tells us what's important and what's not. So for 3.0, which point of view is expressed within the content of this document? Please note there are only 2 possible answers here, either segregation or integration. If you do not know what these words mean, please watch the video that pairs with this lesson. Okay? So that's the first thing. We have to identify that point of view. Is it segregation? Is it integration? Okay? Next, for 3.0, in your own words, summarize the argument for integration segregation presented in the document. Right? Next, for 3.0, if the document supports segregation, and not all do, in what ways does the content or argument presented reflect racism or racist feelings of the time period? If you believe the document makes an argument for integration, leave this box blank. For 3.0, is the argument presented a strong or effective argument? Do not pass judgment on if the argument is right or wrong. Rather, is it a strong or convincing argument? Please type either yes, it's a strong argument, or no, the argument is weak or flawed, in the box below. So again, you have 2 options here, yes or no. Okay? And then here's the last 3.0 question for each document. Analyze the argument. Please explain your reasoning why you selected yes, the argument is strong or effective, or no, the argument is weak or flawed. Okay? So that's all that's required for a 3. And I believe that's what, 5 questions, 4 questions? But 2 of them are basically either or, right? This first one is either segregation or integration, and the second to last one is either yes or no. So really you're only answering 3 questions per document. And with 4 documents remaining after this one, you're asked to basically answer, roughly 12 questions total. It's really not that big of a deal, even though this thing is super long. The amount of work you're actually asked to do is not so bad. So for those who want a higher score, let's take a look at the 3, 5, and 4.0 questions, right? Explain how the source's origin, that is, who wrote it, when it was written, or where it comes from, one of those 3 things, shapes the source's point of view. Right? So because the source comes from this place, how does that help me understand why it says what it says? That's a difficult question, and why it's for the 3.5. Right? Then we have 2 4.0 questions. For a 4.0, right, for a higher score, explain what, if any, because this may not apply. Weaknesses are evident within the argument presented in the document. So I'm not just asking you to explain why an argument is weak, but I'm asking you to pinpoint those weaknesses. Like, this is the actual weakness, right? This is the point at which this argument is not really great. And again, this may or may not apply. So if the argument isn't weak, or you don't say it's weak, then you would leave this box blank. And that leaves you this option for the 4.0, right? For a higher score, identify one similar argument about a current day issue and briefly explain the relationship between the two. So this is asking you to relate your understanding of the past to the present, which is a trickier or higher level skill. Okay, so let's go on ahead and just kind of take a peek. It's not wanting to roll here at the bottom and see what those summative questions look like, just so we're aware of them. They're in our mind. We can kind of, have them in the back of our head as we progress forward here. Again, this is moving super slow. And not all these questions, even though it's like, 13 pages long here, you have to do. Right? So you can see here in bold, it specifies end of documents for 3.0. Please accurately complete questions 1 through 4 of the summative questions below, which ask you to apply everything that you've learned from the documents, right? So this is where you've gathered your evidence, you've thought about each of these things one by one. Now I want you to think of them as a group and sort of explain or demonstrate what you've learned as a whole. All right, so for 3.0 and examining and considering documents 1 through 5 as a group or as a whole, which point of view ultimately makes the stronger case? Those in favor of integration or those in favor of segregation, these are the only two possible answers here. So as you look at these 5 documents, in your assessment or judgment, which side, segregation or integration, makes the best or most convincing argument? Right? The second part then is explain why you believe that this point of view chosen in the previous answer made the strongest argument. Okay? And then we have for 3.0, what is one example or way evidence from documents 1 through 5 support your reasoning? So I need you to pull something from document 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And again, you should have this in the charts above. So it should be pretty easy to copy or revisit your notes, right? That's the whole point here, is to build you up to total understanding, right? You're supposed to be looking back at your previous answers to come up with this. And then the last one here, right, number 4, for 3.0, some of the sources in this lesson are racist. Just because something is racist doesn't mean it has no historical value. And again, we defined that earlier. It's this concept of usefulness, meaning, understanding, right? Not how much something is physically worth, like, hey, the value of this thing is $50. That's not what we're talking about. Does it have value or meaning, right? And please note, in this case, value means something useful or understanding to knowledge, okay? And so you can see here, stop if you are satisfied with the 3.0, you are done. If you wish to challenge yourself for that 3.5 or 4.0, you're going to continue below. Right? I'm going to largely leave these for you guys. I'm going to fix this here if it gives me a chance. And if you are interested in that 3.5 or 4.0, right, these are extremely challenging questions, and that's the point. It's for students to challenge themselves and to reach for those higher grades, right? You're not just proficient, you're demonstrating advanced understanding. And that's how you earn the 3.5 or the 4.0 in my class, right? It's not just about doing more, it's about demonstrating deeper understanding. All right, so we're going to go back up to document 1. And just as a brief reminder here, here we go. Which point of view? And then does the document show? And then in our own words, we need to summarize the argument. So that's where we're going to start here. Okay, so I'm going to read the document through once, and then I'm going to kind of go through and read it again, kind of explaining and breaking things down. So this is an excerpt from the Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? Supreme Court decision, May 1954. Here's the quote. In each case, minors of the Negro race seek the aid of the courts in admission to public schools of their community on a non-segregated basis. In each instance, they had become denied admission to the schools attended by white children under laws requiring or allowing segregation according to race. Today, education is the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws demonstrate recognition. It is required in the performance of basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It's the foundation of good citizenship. Education awakens children to cultural values, preparing them for later professional training. It is doubtful any child can succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. We come then to the question presented. Does segregation of children in public schools on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other factors may be equal, deprive the children of equal educational opportunities? We believe it does. To separate them from other or similar age and qualifications because of race generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. We conclude that in the field of public education, separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities, move it back here, are inherently unequal. So let's go ahead and read this again, this time looking at some of those bolded words and seeing if we can't make a little bit more understanding of this. All right. So in each case, minors, and in this case, minors is someone under the age of 18 of the Negro race, meaning African Americans, right? So kids under 18 who are black are seeking help from the courts to let them into white schools where they live on a non-segregated basis, right? They're asking for integration. In every instance or example, they had been denied, meaning barred or not allowed, admission to schools attended by white children under a law requiring or allowing segregation, that separation of race. Today, education is the most important function or thing that state and local governments kind of do. Compulsory, meaning forced or forced by law. School attendance laws demonstrate recognition, right, show understanding of the importance of education to a democratic or a free society like ours. It is required in the performance of basic public responsibilities, right? You can't function in our society if you aren't educated, right? Good luck getting a job, good luck, doing any number of things if you don't have a solid education of some kind, right? Most employers at least want a high school diploma, many preferring a college degree. And so in order to be a productive member of society, you have to be educated. Right? So preparing them later for professional or job training, it is doubtful that any child can be successful in life if they are denied or not allowed this opportunity, right? The opportunity that is an education. Such an opportunity is a right, something that is promised by law that cannot be taken away, right? Which must be made available to all on equal terms. We then come to the key question here. Does segregation, right, separating white and black children in public schools on the basis, sort of the issue of race, even though the physical facilities, right, the actual school buildings and other factors may be equal, deprive or limit, take away equal educational opportunities? And the Supreme Court concludes, we believe it does. Even though the buildings are, quote, separate but equal, they're like, no, this is not equal. To separate them, I'm over here, from others of similar age and qualification, meaning like, reading level or writing level, right, some kind of qualification, because of race creates a feeling of inferiority, meaning you feel less than someone else. Okay, and that may affect their heart and mind in a way that is unlikely to ever be undone. Once you feel inferior, be made to feel less than someone, you may never feel equal to them. So we conclude, right, we finish by saying that in the area of public education, this idea of separate but equal has no place, because separate educational facilities, right, separate school buildings, are by design unequal, because they make certain students feel like they're less or not equal. And so that feeling alone makes them unequal, minus the whole buildings are falling apart, beat up textbooks that are 20 years old. Right? They're just saying the feeling that a student has that they are not equal is really damaging. And that's the biggest issue of all. All right, so let's go on ahead and go down. And we have to determine the source's point of view. Is it talking about segregation or integration? Well, I think for me, there's one line here that just is super clear and basically says it all, right? We conclude that in the field of public education, separate but equal has no place. And so they're really talking about how separate but equal or segregation is not okay. It doesn't belong. And so if it's the opposite of segregation, it has to be integration. If I can actually get that to go in there. Let me see. I'm having nothing but problems today with this. Let's see. Well, let me do it. There we go. I have to go all the way back. Sorry guys, give me just a second here. It's so weird because the second that I like go down, it just like disappears. It takes forever. Come on, little boxy. Ugh, it only takes out one letter at a time. Sorry guys, I normally like to have this go faster, but it is what it is. There we go. Okay, so let's see if I can not mess it up this time. So again, we have to identify the point of view, right? And that's the idea of, took me all the way to the bottom. You know, if the Supreme Court case is basically saying that we don't accept segregation, that segregation is wrong, then the answer has to be integration. There's no other possible answer, right? So let's see here. Ugh, so obnoxious. There we go. I had faith. All right, so the main idea here is integration. So in our own words, we need to summarize the argument for integration that's presented, right? And so I would say something along these lines. The Supreme Court believes that separate facilities of any kind fix this. Are unequal because they make certain students feel inferior or less than other students. This feeling disadvantages some students because education is necessary to be a successful member of society. Okay. Oh, I'll have to fix that section up there. All right, so you can see here that I really kind of put this in my own words, not that I didn't you know, borrow from the document, but I definitely explained it in my own words, and I can tell that, you know, I understand what I read because I was able to put it in my own words. All right, disadvantages, let me see here. I might just take this one. Sorry guys, this thing is like super slow. I think it's because I'm running so many things in like the background here. Okay, so this brings us to the next question, okay? If the document supports segregation, and not all do, and in this case it supports integration, in what ways does the content or argument presented reflect racism or racist an argument for integration? Leave it blank. So you can see up here we said integration, so we're going to leave this one blank. Right? This is an example of one we get to move on from. Just leave it. All right. Is the argument presented strong judgment on if the argument is right or wrong? Rather, is it a strong argument or not? Please type either yes, yes, the argument is strong, or no, no, the argument is weak or flawed in the box below. I'm going to say yes. I feel like the Supreme Court makes a pretty solid argument here. Just my opinion. Okay. Analyze the argument. Please explain your reasoning. Why you selected yes, the argument is strong or affected, or it's flawed. Okay. The argument, and notice how I didn't say I believe. Right, I'm trying to operate at that slightly higher level here when I'm talking about the argument itself rather than, you know, I feel or I believe. So the argument is strong because, and here I'm going to lay out my opinion. So I'm going to say the argument is strong because the Supreme Court is considering the long-term effects of separation on society and African American children not just focusing on surface level things like books or school buildings. The Supreme Court recognizes that, give it a second to catch up. All right, so the Supreme Court recognizes that equality is not just about physical things, but also treatment and feelings, right? It's this idea that if somebody feels like they're less, well, that's not equal, right? You can say, hey, here's a red 2002 Maserati, here's a red 2002 Maserati, but if somebody doesn't feel equal, right? One person is given, a Maserati that's, has fewer miles on it, and the other person gets one that has a lot of miles on it. That's not fair, right? They look the same, they are the same, but it's not fair, and that person feels like it's not fair, and therefore that is not equal, because in that person's mind, it's not. Okay, I think that's a pretty solid argument, in my opinion. So I've identified kind of the argument, and I've now taken a position on why I feel it's strong. All right, I am going to do the 3.5 and 4.0 questions. I want to model these for those students who want to challenge themselves. For those of you that may not be interested in this, you're free to kind of close out and begin the assignment. We went through the questions at the bottom, but for those of you that want to challenge yourselves, let's take a look here. So explain how the source's origin, right, who wrote it, when it was written, and where it comes from, shapes the source's point of view. So the big thing is that it is the Supreme Court, right? And so the Supreme Court is the court that makes the decisions, decide how our society functions and what is based on our system of government. So I need to identify something about the fact this is from the Supreme Court and how that shapes what it says, right? So since the document was written by the Supreme Court, this explains why they take into consideration the equal treatment of all involved. They are looking at the law fairly and determine that African Americans living under Jim Crow are not being treated fairly like the Constitution requires, right? I'm gonna have to go through and fix some of that, but that's ultimately my answer, right? I know that the Supreme Court, their function is to make decisions based on what is and is not okay in our sort of system of government or laws, right? And so I think that this answer really touches on that. I'm sorry that it's taking so long to type. I'm literally done typing and it's still going. Again, I think it's the function of how much I have going on. Still takes capital O. In the background with, the Google Docs, the recording, all that stuff. So sorry about that, guys. Not much I can do. If I could speed it up, I would. All right, we have two questions here for the 4. For a higher score, explain what, if any, and this may not apply, weaknesses are evident within the argument presented. I said this was a strong argument, so I'm not going to identify any weaknesses simply because I didn't feel that it was a weak argument. So I get to leave this one blank, and that leaves me with this bottom one. Okay, higher score, identify one similar argument about a current day issue and briefly explain the relationship between the two. Okay, here's kind of a controversial one, but one I think that is tied to the current day, and that's sort of attached to Black Lives Matters. So I could talk about how, Black Lives Matters believes that white people accused of crimes and arrested are treated differently and better than African American people who are arrested. The Black Lives Matters movement believes that African Americans face police brutality and higher rates of accidental death than white. Oh, this is a mess because I can't fix it as I go. Let me get this done here and then I'll add to it. Okay. Fix all this. Arrested differently. Believes. I don't need that. I can get rid of it. So let me highlight it. Okay. Believes African American death than whites. Now I need to explain that whole relationship, right? The question specifies, explain the relationship between the two. All right, so this relates to the issue of school segregation in the document because in the document it was believed that African American students were not being educated or treated equally to white students. And so you can see here that I've been kind of clear in my explanation. Hey, in my example, African Americans believe that they face police brutality at higher rates than white people, and that relates to the document because African Americans believe they are not receiving the same educational opportunities as white people. And so that is my relationship. All right, I will go on and fix this off the cam, but thank you for taking the time to watch this. I think this video is particularly important simply because you guys have to know what integration is, segregation is, and understand this background in order to understand the documents in front of you. I look forward to seeing you guys for the next lesson. Thanks.